Welcome back to Saints and Sinners, where halos aren't polished, swords stay sharp, and history is usually bloodier than it wants to remember. Go ahead, hit follow, subscribe, leave a review, because today's tale, it's about a woman who gives no meaning to pray for your enemies. And by pray, I mean, well, you'll see. She wasn't born on a battlefield, but she made enough of them that the poets had to invent new ways of describing fire. She wasn't the soft, serene, saintly type with a harp and a halo. No, this one is more Viking than Valentine. This is the story of a queen whose wrath could level cities, and whose conversion would convert nations. A woman that proved that sometimes God doesn't recruit his saints from the monastery, he recruits them from the ashes. Let me paint you a picture, because this is Saints and Sinners. She was born where the foreshadows stretched long and silent, where rivers curled through the earth like ancient veins carrying secrets older than any kingdom. To most, she was just another girl in a warrior's land, a place where children learned to walk and wield a blade in the very same season. But look closer, and you'd see something different simmering behind her eyes, a stillness too sharp, too focused, like the sea just before it decides to swallow a ship whole. Raised among traders who bargained with steel, raiders who carved their lives out of frost and fire, and survivors who knew that mercy meant death, she was Viking to the marrow. Nothing about her world was ordinary. Kievan Rus wasn't a fairy tale, unless your fairy tales included ambushes, vendettas soaked in blood, and rulers whose crowns were held in place by fear alone. It was a land carved by war, haunted by dynasties that rose and died with the seasons. And in that crucible of brutality, she emerged, not as a victim, but as a queen, a force of nature waiting to be invoked. Imagine a cold northern fog rolling off the river like a warning, longships carved like dragons, slicing through the dawn, and a world where the only law worth anything was the one backed by a blade. Into this world stepped a young woman, quiet, deliberate, impossible to read. Her beauty didn't only inspire poetry, it inspired caution. Men who fell for her braced for her. She married a ruler of great power, a king feared for his strength and admired for his cunning. And then he was murdered. Not in the glory of battle, not in honorable single combat, but in a grotesque ambush. A subjugated tribe bent birch trees like living snare traps, tied his limbs to them, and let nature do the killing. His body broke. Their arrogance didn't. Because after murdering her husband, this tribe decided they deserved her land, and her along with it. They thought the queen would break, that she would weep, bow her head, and accept the fate handed to so many widows in a land ruled by axes and arrogance. But grief does strange things to certain people. For some, it crushes. For others, it sharpens. When the Drevlins sent their first envoy, a smug procession of men who believed themselves conquerors, rode into Kiev with the swagger of wolves who thought they'd already eaten. They brought her a proposal. "Marry our prince," they said. "Unite our peoples. Let us possess what was once your husband's, and you." In their minds, the game was already over. A queen with no army, no protector, no throne without their permission. But if they'd understood her, if they'd seen that quiet, storm-gray calm behind her eyes, they would have known. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to die. She welcomed them with a softness that made even hardened warriors uneasy. A smile played on her lips, not warm, not kind, but something colder, like the first crack forming across a lake of ice. "You seek great honor," she told them, her voice steady as winter wind, "and tradition demands you receive it." She offered them a burial, not after death, but through it. Her men seized the envoys, dragged them to a deep trench already waiting, and lowered them in as they pleaded, cursed, and begged. Earth rained down like judgment, burying their ambitions with their bodies. When the last muffled cry disappeared beneath the soil, the queen stood at the edge of the pit and whispered a single word: begin. Because this was not vengeance. Not yet. This was merely the opening move. The Drevlins, unaware their first emissaries were part of the earth now, sent a second delegation, larger, louder, and full of men who believed force could intimidate a woman carved from iron. She welcomed them too, offered them rest and warm steam in her personal bathhouse, as hospitality demanded. They entered laughing. They exited in ashes. She ordered the doors barred and the structure set ablaze. Their screams rose into the night like a hymn of war, smoke curling heavenward, as if to announce the queen's rebirth. But even this, the burial, the furnace, and the fire, wasn't vengeance. This was all still a prelude, the overture of a saga written in blood. The Drevlins had taken her husband with the brutality of beasts. She would answer with the strategy of a general and the creativity of a poet who composed in flames. The next act in her song of justice would make the first two look merciful. The Drevlins should have known something was wrong when their first envoys never returned, or when their second delegation vanished into silence. But arrogance is a kind of blindness, and theirs was terminal. Still believing the queen was grieving, pliable, and alone, they accepted her request to have a grand feast in her late husband's honor before she wed their prince, as was their custom. A peace offering, she called it, a chance to mend the tear between their peoples, a gesture of goodwill from a widow ready to bow. She rode into their village, humbled, grieving, yet reserved and refined. They were drunk on visions of conquest and the belief that a woman's smile meant surrender. The feast was magnificent. Tables heavy with roasted meat, carved bowls overflowing with mead, musicians plucking strings that echoed like distant thunder. But beneath the beauty, there was tension in the air, a stillness coiled like a serpent waiting for the right breath to strike. She greeted them graciously to the banquet they had prepared, clad in royal cloth, the color of storm clouds. They toasted her, they toasted themselves, they toasted the future they believed they owned. The mead flowed freely, very freely, until boastfulness grew sloppy, and sloppy led into foolish, and foolish into vulnerable. When the last cup was drained, she rose, not with rage, not with trembling grief, but with the calm certainty of a queen who had already counted the bodies. She lifted her hand. 5,000 Drevlin warriors slumped over their cups, drunk, unaware, and exposed. And with a single gesture, her soldiers descended. There was no honor in what followed. No battle, no duel, no glorious clash of champions. Just the quiet, swift slaughter of men who had mistaken a wolf for a lamb. Steel glinted, bodies fell. Mead pooled with blood across the hall's carved floor. When it was over, the feasting tables looked less like a celebration and more like a sacrificial altar. She stepped over them without flinching, her boots leaving clean prints amid the carnage. This wasn't vengeance, not fully. This was justice, cold, strategic, and prophetic. The Drevlins had spilled royal blood. Now they would drown in its consequences. But she wasn't finished. A true Viking saga doesn't burn hot once. It smolders, it builds, and then, when the world thinks the storm is spent, it unleashes its final fury. And that fury was about to fall on the Drevlin capital itself. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire, long before her army ever appeared on the horizon. By the time the Drevlin capital, Iskorostin, caught sight of her banners, they knew death was coming. Not marching, but hunting. The city braced itself, gates barred, archers posted, warlords shouting empty reassurances to hide the tremor in their voices. But the queen didn't charge. She arrived in eerie silence, her warriors fanning out like a dark tide around the city walls. No war cry, no pounding drums, just the cold, patient stare of a woman who had already buried half their nation. The Drevlins expected fury. They expected fire. Instead, they got nothing. Days passed, then weeks. Her army didn't advance. They encircled, tightening the noose one measured breath at a time. Supplies dwindled, water soured, the air inside the walls grew thick with hunger and dread. This was not war. This was strangulation. She knew that steel can topple a kingdom, but starvation breaks it. Only when she sensed their final thread of hope snap did she send her message. "Give me a tribute," she said. "No gold, no silver. Just 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household, and then I'll leave." The Drevlins blinked. Birds? After all that blood, she wanted birds? Confusion washed through the city. Some thought she had lost her mind. Others dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the vengeance was complete. Anything was better than dying behind the stone walls. So they gathered the birds and sent them to her camp. And that's when the Queen of Rus revealed how sharp her mind truly was. The tribute arrived in baskets, wings fluttering, feathers trembling, tiny hearts beating like war drums in miniature. She walked among them with the calm of a woman who already knew how this story ended. To her soldiers, she said quietly, "Prepare the gifts." Tar, sulfur, bits of smoldering cloth twisted into knots, each piece tied carefully to the legs of every pigeon and sparrow. It was madness. Genius disguised as madness. Because these birds didn't belong to the Rus. They belonged to the city behind those tall wooden walls. To the hearths, rafters, and nests they'd flown back to every night since hatching. When the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky burned with Viking gold, she raised her hand, and the soldiers released the firebirds. At first, nothing. Then, a whisper of wings, a feverish storm of sparks trailing behind them as they scattered in all directions. Every bird flew home, into chimneys, under eaves, into lofts where families kept hay dry for the winter, onto rooftops soaked in years of pitch and resin. One spark became 10. 10 became 100. In moments, the entire city bloomed with fire. Not a battle's fire, but a living inferno, feeding on everything it touched. The screams rose next, desperate, choking, furious. Drevlins poured into the streets, only to find the gates blocked, the exit sealed by a ring of steel and shields. She watched the capital ignite, a queen carved from the same ice and iron as her ancestors. This was no frenzy, no madness. This was justice, Viking style. By dawn, Iskurostan lay in ruins, half its people burned, the rest captured or dragged from hiding. She had taken a kingdom with the simplest of weapons, birds. After the ashes cooled, and the Drevlins who survived bent their knees in trembling surrender, she ruled. Not as a placeholder, not as a grieving widow, but as a sovereign with frost in her veins, and a mind sharper than any axe forged in the Rus. And yet, something began to change. Revenge had done its work, but revenge is a poor companion. It doesn't comfort, it doesn't fill the silence of long winter nights, and it doesn't answer the whisper every warrior hears once the blood dries. Now what? She looked outward, toward Constantinople, the jewel of the world, seat of emperors, a city of marble and miracles. If Kiev was carved from wood and iron, Constantinople was carved from heaven. She sailed there draped in furs, flanked by a retinue of warriors who looked terribly out of place against the silk-draped magnificence of Byzantium. And yet, the moment she entered the imperial court, something shifted. The chroniclers say Emperor Constantine VII was immediately struck by her presence. Not her beauty, not her power, but her gravity. She carried herself like a storm contained in human form, dangerous, restrained, and impossible to ignore. He tried to impress her with pageantry, gifts, and negotiation, but she wasn't there for spectacle. She had come for something far more dangerous than alliances or trade agreements. She came for truth, and she was taken by the emperor's fervor for his faith. He was taken by her cunning and beauty, proposing marriage several times. She politely would decline, saying it would be a disgrace to his faith if he marry a pagan. But she listened to the emperor speak about Christ. Not the Christ of icons or liturgy, but the Christ who forgave his enemies, the Christ who died for the guilty, the Christ who loved without vengeance. A God who didn't wait for perfect people, a God who sought the wounded, the angry, and the shattered. A God who, shockingly, might want someone like her. And there beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, with mosaics glittering like 1,000 frozen suns, she felt something she had not felt since the day her husband died. A warmth that did not burn, a fire that did not destroy, but a vision of power that required no blood at all. She asked to be baptized. Those present said the emperor himself stepped forward to sponsor her. Astonished that the warrior, queen of the Rus, would kneel before the cross instead of the sword, they poured the water over her, and she rose from the baptismal font with a new name, a name meaning light. Imagine that, the woman who torched an entire kingdom, now reborn in a flame that sanctifies, not destroys. Constantine proposed marriage to her again, to which she responded that it would be incestuous for her godfather to become her husband. When she returned to Kiev, the people expected laws, armies, and another campaign of conquest. Instead, she brought a cross, a vision, and a new way. Her pagan advisors didn't understand. Her warriors muttered. Her people hesitated. But her, she didn't flinch. She planted seeds of faith in a land still dripping with the blood of her vengeance. She built churches, invited priests, reshaped law, and protected the poor. One woman, standing alone against a kingdom not yet ready to follow her into the light. But sanctity begins with the first spark, and she had already shown what a spark could do to a city. Her old world died with the Drevlins, but her new world lived through her grandson, a boy who grew up watching her rule, absorbing her boldness and her faith. He would become Vladimir the Great, the ruler who baptized an entire nation. His conversion is famous, but the fire that lit the fuse, it began with her, with the woman who once set a city ablaze and later set her soul ablaze, with the queen who embraced the cross after mastering the sword, with the Viking widow who went down in history as the first Christian ruler of the Rus and the first canonized saint of her people. That's the strange part about grace. It doesn't tiptoe around violence or vengeance. It walks straight into the ashes and builds a cathedral. So who was she? This avenger, the fire starter, the diplomat, the queen who bowed to no man but knelt before God? Her name was Olga, and her baptismal name was Helena. She's known by both, but she's recorded as Saint Olga of Kiev, princess, matriarch, and torchbearer of a new faith in a land of warriors. The saint who proved that God can turn even a Viking inferno into a beacon that guides nations. So what do we do with a woman like her? A woman who answered betrayal with fire, answered arrogance with annihilation, and answered injustice with the kind of creativity that would make even the sagas blush. And then, somehow, become a saint. Saint Olga doesn't fit in our neat little pews. She doesn't smile politely in stained glass. She doesn't sit quietly in devotional books. She arrives like she lived, with a torch in one hand and a baptismal font in the other. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why we need her. Because the truth is, most of us don't struggle with looking too holy. We struggle with being too human, too angry, too wounded, too reactive, and too ready to burn down cities. If not with fire, then with our words, our grudges, and our refusal to forgive. So what do we learn from a woman who burned cities with pigeons and then led a nation with the gospel? God doesn't wait for gentle souls with tidy pasts. He recruits the fierce, the stubborn, and the relentless. Her conversion wasn't delicate or dainty. It was a total reordering of her fire, not the extinguishing of it. She teaches us that your intensity isn't the problem. Your aim is. The difference is who you serve. Strength without God becomes vengeance. Strength with God becomes protection. The same fire that once scorched her enemies later warmed an entire nation. Grace doesn't erase your intensity. It redirects it. It doesn't smother your fire. It purifies it. It doesn't make you less powerful. It teaches you where that power belongs. He'll turn it into a force for salvation instead of destruction if you let him. So if you've ever been told you're too bold, too loud, too fierce, or too angry, remember the Viking queen who became a saint. In God's hands, the traits that once caused destruction can become the very force that defends the weak, shields the vulnerable, and builds something holy. Strength without mercy is tyranny, but strength surrendered to God, that can change a nation. Leave a review, hit subscribe, and follow us as we uncover more stories where the sacred meets the scarred. Until next time, keep your fire fierce, your heart yielded, and your axe aimed in the right direction, because saints rise, sinners fall, and history bears witness.